Tears of the Kingdom is less than a week away, and in preparation for the game and its bosses, I wanted to take a retrospective look at all the best bosses of 3D Zelda. So first of all, let's define what a good boss is. In my own research, I think I would consider a good boss if it falls into 4 main categories. First of all, story relevance. If a boss plays a weak role in the story or feels out of place in context, then it's not good. Second, a boss needs to use the mechanics at hand in an interesting way. In the case of Zelda especially, a boss needs to make good use out of the newly gained item, almost like a final exam with the study period being all the dungeon before the boss. Third, uniqueness/design. A great boss is fun to look at, and the more unique while still making sense in context, the better. And finally, a good boss just needs to be fun. A boss can follow the first 3 and still not be fun, so in the end, that's what really matters most. And with that, let's look at the best 3D bosses of Zelda, starting with Ocarina of Time. And this one gave out some tough choices. Honestly, it would be easier to say the bosses that sucked rather than the best ones, and for that, I would surely say Morpha of the Water Temple and Baronade from Inside Jabu Jabu. But other than those, everything in Ocarina of Time is fun and engaging, but some do stand out in my opinion. First, I'd have to say Queen Goma. Now, it might be for a more nostalgic reason, as when I was a kid, I could never get much further than the Great Deku Tree. However, Goma works perfectly to explain the main Zelda quirk of targeting the eye, along with mechanics like spamming your sword and targeting with the slingshot. Overall, a great starter boss. Going on, I'd have to say Phantom Ganon. In Ocarina of Time, it's easily the best Phantom Ganon we've seen up to date. Here, he plays very unique with the canvas hopping mechanic, and then of course he has the classic Phantom Ganon gameplay loop of Pong. Truly, there's nothing better than him. And next we have Bongo Bongo, and I adore this boss. It's so unique in the fact that the boss arena is literally a giant bongo that bounces with Bongo Bongos playing, and its excellent use of the Lens of Truth is incredibly fun. There's nothing else to say besides hee hee funny bongo boy. Following up, we have possibly one of the most endearing Zelda mini-bosses, plus a pretty interesting actual boss. Iron Knuckles, or rather Brainwashed Naboru, must be one of the best mini-bosses of all of Zelda, if only for a story reason. And then Twin Rova with the Mirror Shield gameplay alongside Naboru makes an overall excellent dungeon, and I'd love to talk more about them especially, but it's really too good to spoil for those of you who haven't experienced it yourself. Next is Dark Link, a boss I've never really understood from a story perspective, but nonetheless he completely and utterly excels at all other boss requirements, so he certainly belongs here. And finally, to end Ocarina of Time, I think we should add Ganondorf. Ganondorf is a more difficult reprise of Phantom Ganon's Pong, but where the fun really starts is with Ganon, and all the weaving and incredible N64 combat you get to do. Ganon plays just like a Dodongo or even a Stone Talus, but with swords, as the only place he is vulnerable is on his tail. It's a simple fight, but still quite difficult and a great way to round off an amazing game. And that was only the first game, but please, don't worry, truly no other game steps up to the insane level of Ocarina of Time, at least for the few days before Tears of the Kingdom. I hope. Anyways, let's go on to Majora's Mask. Now this one is tricky, but for a different reason. You see, I've only beaten the game up to the last 2 dungeons. Now, that might not be a huge problem, but I was getting some outside insight on this video from a Zelda enjoyer like myself, and according to him, who's beaten the game, the very last 2 bosses were the best, and I trust Jerry with my life. So I'll spread it to you all as well. The best bosses in Majora's Mask are Twin Mold and Majora, with Goat as a close-ish third. If you agree with Jerry, be sure to tell us all why they're so good, and make sure to subscribe to help us get to 1,000 subs while you're at it. And if you disagree, well, you'll just have to find it in your heart to tell Jerry that. And I don't even think the worst psychopaths could even do that. The next game is Wind Waker, and if I'm being perfectly honest, the bosses are one of the weakest aspects of the entire game. The dungeons are great, the exploration is almost unbeatable, and the side quests are incredible. But the bosses are just overall weak. Now that certainly isn't to say that the bosses are unfun or suck, but they're all unmemorable and don't stand a chance to even the worst of Ocarina of Time. I think from the entire game, I would probably say my favorites are Goma and Ganondorf. In this game, Goma plays as a giant lobster thing, and you have to use a grappling hook to swing across the battlefield to weaken it. Then Ganondorf is another simple sword fight, but I had to include it because nothing can truly beat the final moments of Wind Waker with Ganondorf. Continuing on to Twilight Princess, we're luckily back into the memorable bosses territory, and there's no other boss I can start with than Blizzetta. Blizzetta is the final boss of Snow Peak Ruins Temple, and here I have to first talk about the context of the temple itself, because that's truly what makes or breaks the boss. Snow Peak Ruins is the home of Yida and Yido. Yida became sick prior to the discovery of the temple when Yido gave her a piece of the Mirror of the Twilight. Throughout the dungeon, you're tasked with finding ingredients to make a better soup for Yida. But once she glazed over the shard of the Mirror of Twilight, she transformed into a terrifying creature of the name Blizzetta. The battle itself is simple, but still makes a really good use out of the dungeon's item, Ball and Chain. And with that, any list of the best Zelda bosses is sorely mistaken if it fails to include Blizzetta. More on Twilight Princess, I have to include Star-Lord, if only because of how fun and unique the Beyblade spinner is. I truly don't believe any other Zelda game will ever have items as fun or as unique as Twilight Princess is. Now, I'd love to talk more about Twilight Princess, but I'm just going to go on to Skyward Sword before we have another Ocarina of Time situation. This here is a unique situation to other games with the motion control gameplay, but a good boss is still a good boss. Girahim is one of the reoccurring bosses in this game and doesn't change too much between each, however, it's an interesting fight and a good lesson on how to use the motion controls. But next is Koloktos, a boss that works as a twist on the robot bosses of prior games. This one has an excellent use of the dungeon's item Whip, and you can't not feel like a badass when you use the giant swords to slash down the monolith. And to round out Skyward Sword, I'd have to mention Demise. While not the hardest boss or even the most interesting, I have to include it for the humongous lore implications it has by, well, creating the whole hero, princess, and demon cycle. Other than that, of course, as I said, it's not very difficult, but it's not that miserable. And finally, at last, let's talk about Breath of the Wild. But before I get into that, let's have some real talk for a moment. Now, I would love to make more videos speculating and theorizing on Tears of the Kingdom, but however, unfortunately due to the leak, up until May 12th, I won't do that as to keep myself and my viewers safe from seeing spoilers in the comments. And if you're one of the people who's about to spoil the game, maybe don't. It's a bit rude. And if you already made a comment spoiling the game, then I hope you might consider deleting it. And with that out of the way, let's see one of the most interesting Zelda games when it comes to bosses. Now, I've spent a great deal of time on my channel talking about how the bosses of Breath of the Wild are disappointing, especially when compared to previous Zeldas, as you've all seen by now. But that isn't to say that Breath of the Wild's bosses are bad. So, of Breath of the Wild's best bosses, first I'd have to say one of them would be Master Koga, and that's not even close to a joke. Of the 8-ish bosses of Breath of the Wild, Koga is second to best. Koga is hilarious and makes a really fun use of all the runes. The boss isn't difficult by any means, but the build up to his ferocity by the Yiga and the subversion of his goofiness is unbeatable. And I don't want to include Age of Calamity here, but his storyline there makes him all the better in Breath of the Wild. In all, he makes an amazing boss. But what happens when you take an amazing boss and add an entire campaign to build him up with a completely serious version and then maybe add $20 too? You get Monk Maz Kosha. And I'll tell you, there's nothing better than seeing the shock on someone's face when they finally see who's the final fight of Champions Ballad expansion. And if you have the fact that they took some of the best parts of Master Koga and added so much more, there's no reason to hate this boss. Now, with that, you might think I'm hypocritical for loving Monk Maz Kosha, but not enjoying the Blights as much. And you'd probably be right. But I'm only human. And to end this list off, I think I'm going to include a little controversial choice. I really enjoy Dark Beast Ganon. It isn't a good fight, but it's an amazing cutscene. And if you reframe it like that, it's so much better. I think I would be quite let down if Breath of the Wild ended with Calamity Ganon. Now, I don't think Calamity Ganon is bad, but I don't think it's a good conclusion. Dark Beast Ganon, however, is the exact right amount of cinematic boss fight I needed after a grand exploration like Breath of the Wild. And I hope you'll agree with me. And if you don't, then absolutely tell me your list of the best bosses. If I were to choose the top 5 from all the games, I think it would be number 5, Demise, 4, Dark Link, 3, Bongo Bongo, 2, Munkmas Kosha, and number 1, Blizzetta. And with that, I hope you'll subscribe and hit the bell to come back Wednesday for another video, maybe. And until then, keep cool!